Little boardwalk here. Oh, so we're like half the way in. You are here. Or whether maybe the scale of the place is actually gigantic, but it's not that big. They said that the boardwalk is good to walk on because otherwise it gets slippery. It takes you a while. Definitely windy here though. It almost seems like when we get to the end there should be like a little pond or something, you know? But I don't think that's probably the case. No, that wasn't the case. It's just a dry, maybe former, sometimes pond area at the end of the little walk that we took. But before I talk more about White Sands National Monument that we visited in southern New Mexico, I just wanted to tell you how we got there. We got on a very early flight from White Plains, New York, Westchester County Airport, and flew down to Atlanta. And then we changed planes, had a pretty quick layover, and then flew to El Paso, Texas, just south of the New Mexico border, right on the U.S.-Mexican border. And where we flew from, you can see from this map, eastern half of the U.S. tends to be much wetter and greener, and that's the part of the country where we flew from, where like 80% of the population of the U.S. lives. To the western U.S., which we like to visit. We previously had visited South Dakota during the summer. I have some videos on that on the channel. And we wanted to try out another western state, so we were going to do a pretty thorough visit of New Mexico, which, as you can see from this map, is very dry, not too much green areas at all. Actually, its neighboring state, Arizona, to the west, shows a fair amount of green area, but I know Arizona is not really known for being very green either, so they're not pulling any punches with New Mexico. It's dry. And we flew into El Paso. It just worked out better for us timing-wise. The flights into Albuquerque were more expensive or were arriving later in the day, sometimes at night, and we didn't want to arrive in New Mexico, a state we don't really know that well, at night. So we got there in the morning and then rented a car and drove up to White Sands National Monument, which is not too far north. It was like an hour and a half north of El Paso. And we stopped to get water at a Walmart. And then my wife has her favorite store that was right next door, so she went in there for a little bit. And then we continued on to where we wanted to go our first day. And that was White Sands National Park. I called it a monument earlier because it's not that big of a park. I don't know what the dividing line is between a national monument and a national park. Sometimes a monument looks like a park and vice versa. So this was a relatively small national park, but packs a lot of punch for its size. And the main visitor center is right off a highway that runs between Alamogordo and Las Cruces. And it's like 10 miles south of Alamogordo. So we went in here. It's a nice Adobe-style visitor center, and they have a bookshop, a couple of stores, and general information you can get. We didn't stay there very long, but I thought it was well done. There's no lodge to stay at here at this national park like there are at other national parks, like the one we stayed at in Badlands National Park in South Dakota. So this is just a visitor center. So we stopped here, read some signs. This visitor center, I guess, was built by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s during the Great Depression as a way of providing jobs. And this just shows you that what we saw on our first day. I mean, the scenery is fantastic, just abrupt mountains rising up out of the flat, high desert. It's really interesting. So let's get back to showing you more of the national park. Was just built in 2019.
Yeah, then you go kind of turn around and it comes back this way.
Yeah, just a little loop. I mean, a little cul-de-sac at the end. So yeah, as we drove along, we came across a parking area where you could stop and take a walk on this boardwalk that goes through the sand dunes. And I'll show you some video footage from our walk on this boardwalk. It's like the winds constantly blow here. Coming to the end of the boardwalk. This does look nice. Okay. I thought it would be just sand, not grass, too. So what do you do at a national park that's mostly sand dunes? Well, one thing is have your picture taken by complete strangers at the end of a boardwalk. Read a little bit about the history of how the sand dunes came to be. And it has to do with ancient oceans that used to cover this area of the western U.S. I always find that hard to believe. I've read about that in other cases, but it's part of the reason how the sand got there, but took place millions and millions of years ago. Take more pictures. And then I think just generally to look at scenery that's so different from the scenery around you, from where you woke up that morning, and you realize you're so far away from home in a single day. So that's pretty neat. And then we got back on the road and drove further in. And as we did, we discovered that there was less and less plant life, and it was almost all sand. And you can see from this picture how they go through, it's like you would plow snow. They plow a road out of the sand, and it's piled up on the sides. So there were other people there, and that's one of the things I'll show in upcoming video clips. Look at all the dust kicking up in the parking lot.
Yeah.
Constantly windy here. They call this whole bowl between the two mountain ranges that run north-south, and we're in the middle. They call this the playa. So it reminds me of Burning Man, where they have the event in Nevada north of Reno every summer, and they call that the playa. And the sand is really fine. If you're a sand connoisseur, this would be like the finest green sand there is. They have these sheds so that it protects you from getting sand in your food. We're going to go to the very end of the picnic area. It looks like Burning Man with all those space-age designs. again of coming to a national park late in the day. So as we drove along, we saw at different points you could rent like these saucer type sleds to try to slide down the sand dunes. And we saw different people trying, but it's not quite as slick as the snow. So people, when we were there anyway, weren't that successful at going down the dunes, but that was another thing you could do there. And mainly it's people who just like to come and walk up on top of the dunes and just look out over the expansiveness of nothing. And it's also an interesting location in that it's part of the White Sands Missile Range, which is one of the largest land area military properties in the US, if not the world. And they use it to practice shooting missiles. And occasionally we were told they close the park to nobody can go in there because there's missiles being fired overhead. So where this national park is at the southern end of the White Sands Missile Weapon Research Land Area, whatever you want to call it. And way at the northern end, which is like 30, 40 miles away, is where they did the first test of an atomic bomb. So sometimes when you hear about White Sands, you think automatically of the atom bomb during World War II. Yeah, this is the same area, but it's way at the southern end, and I guess there's no possibility of running into an unexploded missile or something that has landed in this part of the park. It's sort of one small area, part of a huge area of sand dunes that they've taken over for use for military use. And I was reading that when they've done tests over time, there have been errant missiles that went way off course. One landed in Mexico and another landed, I think, sort of near Las Cruces, but out in the mountains somewhere. Fortunately, errant missile has never landed in a populated area, but that's makes it kind of otherworldly as this already is just by appearance. And it is like being on another planet. You can see the mountains in the distance. They're a line of mountains that run north-south along the western edge of this huge playa or sand dune area. And then there's another mountain range behind the camera also running north-south. So this is in the middle of this high valley that's high in altitude. I forget what altitude we're at here, but it's pretty safe to say it's close to a mile high. So when we were there, it was cool. The sun was bright. It might have got up into the 80s, and maybe it got a little warmer before we got there, but it was warm in late September when we were there. And again, you can see the sand piled up on the side of the road that they have to continuously plow to make it passable for the public to use. And when I was referring to like a space age design, I was referring to these picnic shelters that they have, none of which were being used when we were there. It was late in the afternoon, but they did kind of remind me of Burning Man in a way, this whole arrangement. So it is an interesting area to visit. We saw what we saw. Didn't take that long. Went back to our motel where we checked in Alamogordo, which is the only town fairly nearby. You pretty much have to stay at one of the roadside hotels there that are decent. When we drove to Alamogordo, we drove through one area where there was a sign that said, "Don't pick up any hitchhikers," because there are correctional facilities in the area. And we did see one. And that is a standard highway sign. I've seen that in other places of the country. But it sort of added to the creepiness of this overall area and just the general lack of population in the area. So Alamogordo was the only town for 50 miles in any direction. So you stayed there. And we went to a Chili's restaurant that night, and it was fine. And our room at our motel was fine. And the next morning, we actually found a Dunkin' Donuts, which was fine. So we didn't see too many Dunkin' Donuts in New Mexico. So we were probably lucky to find the one we did in Alamogordo. And then we continued driving north, and this was the main site to see in this area of south central New Mexico. And we drove through the town of Carrizozo, which was an interesting town. I should have taken some pictures, but it's a town where a lot of people have moved out. There's still some people that live there, but their entire downtown was filled with vacant stores. Not a single store was in operation that we saw, but the state of New Mexico, or the county that Carrizozo was in, was doing an interesting thing. They were repaving all the sidewalks and all the streets to fix it all up. For who is going to move there or move back to Carrizozo in the future remains to be seen. It's so off in the middle of nowhere in central New Mexico. So we drove through there, and then we drove up. We were headed for Santa Fe, so there wasn't a road that goes directly there, and Google Maps is telling us not to get on the main north-south highway that runs through New Mexico, Highway 25. It told us to bear east and then go back northwest into Santa Fe, and that'll be in an upcoming video. But I just wanted to show you where else we went. We stayed in Santa Fe for 3 nights, and we went to different places in that area and stayed within Santa Fe. And I should mention that one morning while we were in Santa Fe, I took the train down to Albuquerque, the Rail Runner Express, and walked around downtown Albuquerque a little bit and then got back on the train, went back up to Santa Fe, and there'll be a couple of videos coming out from that. And then we went up way up to the top of New Mexico, the northern border with Colorado, and we took an antique railroad ride. It turned out to be an all-day thing, and I have a video on that. Beautiful area. I can't recommend the area of northern New Mexico enough. There's just so much beauty, and there's no one hardly living up there. It's just beautiful. We went through some valleys, and we were like the only people on the highway. And these were 2, 3, sometimes 4-lane highways, and we'd be the only people driving east-west or north-south through this area. And then after the railroad excursion ride that we took, we drove down to Taos, where we stayed one night. And that was an interesting town, and the drive into Taos was just beautiful. And I'll try to capture that in an upcoming video. And then after Taos, we had a lot of driving to do the next day. We had to get all the way back down south, down to Carlsbad, New Mexico, because we're going to go see the Carlsbad Caverns the next day. So we followed Google Maps. It took us through the outskirts of Las Vegas, New Mexico, not Nevada. And we didn't actually go into the downtown there. I've heard it looks very typical and historical, but the part we saw, which is as true of a lot of towns in New Mexico, but it's not just New Mexico, it's all across the United States. A lot of times when you're driving in from the outside, they don't look so good. And we stopped at a Walmart again to use the restrooms and stuff, but it wasn't that exciting or anything. And then we drove through a real desolate part of the state down to Roswell, which I will show in another video. I won't talk too much about that now. And then we went down to Carlsbad, where we stayed overnight at a really nice historical hotel before we went to Carlsbad Caverns the next day, Guadalupe National Park briefly in Texas, and then back to El Paso, to where we stayed the last night before we flew back east. So that's it for this video on White Sands National Park, and look for my upcoming videos on New Mexico. Thanks for watching.